Sarah Martinez wheeled herself through the automatic doors of Riverside Community College, her worn backpack balanced precariously on her lap. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete walkway, and she could already hear the familiar whispers that followed her everywhere she went. At 19, Sarah had grown accustomed to the stares, the pointing, and the cruel nicknames that students thought she couldn't hear. "There goes the wheelchair freak," someone muttered from behind a cluster of students near the cafeteria entrance. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes fixed straight ahead. She had learned long ago that acknowledging the taunts only made them worse. Her disability wasn't something she was born with. 3 years earlier, during her junior year of high school, Sarah had been riding in the passenger seat when a drunk driver slammed into their family car at 60 miles per hour. The impact crushed 2 vertebrae in her lower spine, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. Her dreams of joining the military like her grandfather had been shattered in an instant, along with her legs. The transition back to school had been brutal. Her former friends gradually drifted away, uncomfortable with her new reality. The cheerleading squad she had once captained moved on without her. Even her boyfriend of 2 years had broken up with her just weeks after the accident, claiming he couldn't handle the situation. Sarah found herself isolated, spending most of her time alone in her modified bedroom, staring at the military medals her grandfather had left her before his death. But Sarah was tougher than anyone gave her credit for. Despite the physical limitations and emotional trauma, she had graduated high school with honors and enrolled in community college with a determination that surprised even her own family. Her mother, Maria, worried constantly about her daughter's decision to face the world again, but Sarah refused to hide away any longer. The college campus presented daily challenges that most students never considered. Ramps were often blocked by carelessly parked bicycles or maintenance equipment. Elevators frequently broke down, stranding her on the wrong floor. Bathroom facilities designed for wheelchair users were sometimes locked or being used as storage spaces. But perhaps the most difficult obstacle was the constant social isolation and mockery she faced from other students. Jessica Palmer was the worst of her tormentors. A blonde sophomore who seemed to take personal pleasure in making Sarah's life miserable, Jessica had coined the nickname wheelchair freak during Sarah's first week on campus. She would deliberately block narrow pathways, forcing Sarah to ask her to move. She organized her friends to sit in the wheelchair-accessible seating areas just to watch Sarah struggle to find alternative spots. The harassment was relentless and calculated. "Hey freak, need someone to push you up the ramp?" Jessica called out one particularly difficult Tuesday morning, causing her circle of friends to burst into laughter. Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation, but she continued toward her psychology class without responding. She had learned that any reaction only fueled Jessica's cruelty. Professor Williams, her psychology instructor, was one of the few faculty members who treated Sarah with genuine respect and kindness. He had noticed the social dynamics affecting his student and made subtle efforts to create a more inclusive classroom environment. During group discussions, he would ensure Sarah's contributions were heard and valued. But even his support couldn't shield her from the harsh realities she faced in hallways, the cafeteria, and common areas. The isolation was taking its toll on Sarah's mental health. She found herself skipping meals to avoid the cafeteria, where Jessica and her friends often gathered. Her grades began to slip slightly as she struggled to concentrate during lectures while anticipating the next humiliating encounter. Sleep became elusive as she replayed each day's cruel interactions, wondering if returning to school had been a terrible mistake. One evening, while organizing her grandfather's belongings that her mother had recently given her, Sarah discovered a small wooden box she had never seen before. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was a military patch unlike any she had encountered in her research about her grandfather's service. The patch was predominantly black with silver threading, featuring a stylized ghost figure surrounded by what appeared to be psychological warfare symbols. The words PSYOP were embroidered along the bottom in barely visible thread. Sarah held the patch up to her desk lamp, examining its intricate details. Her grandfather had served in Vietnam, but he had rarely spoken about his specific duties or experiences. Her grandmother had mentioned that he did special work for the military but had never elaborated. This patch seemed to suggest involvement in psychological operations, a field Sarah was just beginning to learn about in her psychology courses. The discovery sparked something in Sarah that had been dormant since her accident. Her grandfather had faced his own battles, both literal and psychological, and had emerged as a decorated veteran. Perhaps his legacy could provide the strength she needed to face her own daily warfare against ignorance and cruelty. That night, she carefully sewed the patch onto her favorite denim jacket, positioning it where it would be visible but not ostentatious. Wearing the patch to school the next day felt like carrying a piece of her grandfather's courage with her. Most students didn't notice the small addition to her appearance, but Sarah felt different somehow. The patch reminded her that she came from a family of fighters, people who didn't back down when facing adversity. When Jessica made her usual cruel comments near the library entrance, Sarah found herself sitting a little straighter in her wheelchair, meeting the other girl's eyes with newfound defiance. The patch became Sarah's daily armor, a visible connection to her family's military heritage and her grandfather's mysterious service. She began researching psychological operations, fascinated by the strategic thinking and mental resilience required for such work. The more she learned, the more she understood that her current situation was its own form of psychological warfare, with Jessica and her followers attempting to break down her confidence and self-worth through systematic harassment. But Sarah was beginning to realize that she possessed weapons of her own in this battle. Her intelligence, determination, and growing understanding of psychological tactics could be turned against those who sought to diminish her. The wheelchair that others saw as a symbol of weakness was becoming, in her mind, a throne of resilience from which she could observe and analyze her enemy's strategies. As weeks passed, Sarah noticed patterns in Jessica's behavior and that of her followers. The harassment was most intense when they had an audience, suggesting that the cruelty was partly performative. Jessica seemed to target Sarah most aggressively when she appeared happy or confident, indicating that Sarah's emotional state was being monitored and weaponized against her. These observations began forming the foundation of Sarah's own psychological strategy. The patch continued to draw occasional curious glances from students and faculty, but no one seemed to recognize its significance or understand its connection to military psychological operations. Sarah's research had revealed that PSYOP units were among the most secretive and specialized branches of military service, often operating behind enemy lines to influence behavior and decision-making through carefully crafted psychological techniques. Her grandfather's involvement in such work suggested a level of mental toughness and strategic thinking that Sarah was determined to honor. Each morning, as she prepared for another day of potential humiliation and harassment, she would touch the patch and remember that she carried the legacy of someone who had faced much greater challenges and emerged victorious. The transformation in Sarah's demeanor was subtle but noticeable to those who paid attention. She began making eye contact with her tormentors rather than looking away. Her posture improved, and she carried herself with growing confidence despite the wheelchair. When Jessica made cruel comments, Sarah would sometimes respond with a slight smile that seemed to unnerve her attacker, as if she knew something that others didn't. This psychological shift began to affect the dynamics of Sarah's daily interactions. Some of Jessica's followers seemed less enthusiastic about participating in the harassment when their target appeared unaffected by their efforts. A few students who had previously ignored Sarah's plight began offering small gestures of support, perhaps sensing her growing strength and dignity. But Sarah knew that the real test of her newfound psychological armor was yet to come. Jessica's cruelty was escalating as her usual tactics became less effective, and Sarah sensed that a major confrontation was approaching. The patch on her jacket felt heavier each day, weighted with the responsibility of living up to her grandfather's legacy and proving that physical limitations could not diminish the power of a determined mind. The stage was being set for a battle that would test everything Sarah had learned about psychological warfare, personal resilience, and the true meaning of strength. Little did she know that her grandfather's mysterious patch would soon attract the attention of someone who could change her life forever, someone who understood exactly what the PSYOP ghost symbol represented and the extraordinary capabilities it implied. Colonel Marcus Thompson walked across the Riverside Community College campus with the measured stride of someone accustomed to command. At 55, he maintained the bearing and discipline that had carried him through 30 years of military service, including multiple deployments and classified operations that most people would never know about. He was visiting the college as part of a veteran outreach program, scheduled to speak with students about military career opportunities and educational benefits. The colonel had seen many things during his distinguished career, from conventional warfare to the most secretive psychological operations conducted in hostile territories. His own background included extensive work with PSYOP units during his younger years, before advancing to command positions that required broader strategic oversight. He understood the unique mentality and capabilities required for psychological warfare better than almost anyone in the active military. As he made his way toward the administrative building for his meeting with the dean, Colonel Thompson's trained eye automatically scanned the campus environment, noting security considerations and student demographics out of habit. It was during this casual observation that he spotted something that made him stop in his tracks. A young woman in a wheelchair was navigating the crowded pathway between buildings, and prominently displayed on her denim jacket was a patch that Colonel Thompson recognized immediately. The PSYOP ghost patch was not something worn casually or obtained through normal military surplus channels. It was earned through some of the most demanding training and dangerous assignments in the military, and seeing it on a civilian college student raised immediate questions about its authenticity and significance. Sarah was wheeling herself toward the library, unaware that she had attracted the attention of someone who actually understood what she was wearing. The morning had brought the usual challenges. Jessica Palmer had accidentally spilled coffee near Sarah's wheelchair earlier, forcing her to navigate around the sticky mess while enduring mocking laughter from the gathered crowd. But Sarah's response had been different this time. Instead of showing embarrassment or distress, she had calmly cleaned her wheels and continued on her way with a slight smile that seemed to unnerve her tormentors. Colonel Thompson approached Sarah carefully, not wanting to startle her or create a scene that might draw unwanted attention. His experience in psychological operations had taught him the value of subtle initial contact and careful assessment before revealing his own knowledge or intentions. "Excuse me, miss," he said in a respectful tone that immediately distinguished him from the typical interactions Sarah experienced on campus. "I couldn't help but notice your patch. That's quite an interesting piece of military history you're wearing." Sarah looked up at the speaker and immediately recognized something different about this man. His posture, manner of speaking, and direct eye contact all suggested military background. But there was also a quality of genuine respect in his voice that she rarely encountered from strangers. "Thank you," Sarah replied cautiously. "It belonged to my grandfather. He served in Vietnam, though he never talked much about what he did over there." Colonel Thompson nodded slowly, his experienced eye taking in more details about Sarah's demeanor and presentation. Despite her youth and obvious physical challenges, she carried herself with a dignity that impressed him. The way she wore the patch prominently but not ostentatiously suggested someone who understood its significance rather than merely displaying a family heirloom for shock value. "Your grandfather must have been quite a soldier," the colonel observed. "That particular patch isn't something that was handed out lightly." "May I ask his name and unit?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, uncertain about sharing personal information with a stranger. But something about this man's respectful demeanor and obvious military knowledge encouraged her to respond. "Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, though I'm not sure about his specific unit designation. My grandmother said he did special work that he couldn't discuss, even with family." The colonel's eyebrows raised slightly. "Martinez. Miguel Martinez. The name sounds familiar, though I'd have to check some records to be certain. But if he earned that patch legitimately, he was involved in some of the most challenging and important work our military conducted during that era." "What exactly is PSYOP?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about her grandfather's service. "I've been researching it since I found this patch, but most of the information I can find is pretty general or classified." Colonel Thompson smiled slightly, recognizing an opportunity to honor a fellow veteran's legacy while potentially helping this impressive young woman understand her family history. Psychological operations, PSYOP, involves using information and psychological techniques to influence enemy behavior and decision-making. It requires exceptional mental toughness, strategic thinking, and the ability to operate under extreme pressure while maintaining absolute discretion. As he spoke, Colonel Thompson observed Sarah's reactions carefully. Her questions were intelligent and focused, and her body language suggested someone who was genuinely interested in understanding rather than merely collecting interesting stories. More importantly, he noticed how she seemed to straighten in her wheelchair as he described the mental attributes required for psychological operations, as if recognizing qualities within herself. Your grandfather would have undergone some of the most rigorous psychological training in the military, the colonel continued. PSYOP personnel need to understand human behavior at a fundamental level, anticipate reactions under stress, and maintain their own psychological stability while operating in hostile environments. It's not work for everyone. Sarah absorbed this information with growing fascination and pride. The description of psychological warfare resonated with her own recent experiences in ways that surprised her. She had been unconsciously applying some of these same principles in her daily battles with Jessica Palmer and other tormentors, though she hadn't recognized the connection to military strategy. I've been dealing with some psychological warfare of my own lately, Sarah admitted, then immediately wondered if she had said too much to this stranger. Colonel Thompson's expression grew more serious. How so? Sarah found herself explaining the daily harassment she faced on campus, the systematic attempts to humiliate and isolate her, and her growing understanding of the psychological patterns behind the cruelty. As she spoke, Colonel Thompson listened with the focused attention of someone who understood both the tactical and personal dimensions of what she was describing. What you're describing is indeed a form of psychological warfare, the colonel confirmed. And it sounds like you've been developing some effective countermeasures, whether you realize it or not. The way you're analyzing your opponent's behavior and adjusting your responses shows the kind of strategic thinking that your grandfather would have recognized. The validation from someone with obvious authority and expertise was more meaningful to Sarah than she had expected. For months, she had been struggling alone with the harassment, wondering if she was overreacting or being too sensitive. To have a military professional confirm that her experiences constituted actual psychological warfare helped her understand that her responses weren't paranoia but legitimate tactical thinking. I have a meeting with the college administration in a few minutes, Colonel Thompson said, glancing at his watch. But I'd like to continue this conversation if you're interested. Would you be willing to meet with me later today? I think there are some things about your grandfather's service that might interest you, and possibly some opportunities that might interest you as well. Sarah agreed to meet the colonel later that afternoon in the student center. As he walked away toward the administrative building, she felt a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness. The encounter had been unlike anything she had experienced since starting college, and she sensed that it might represent a turning point in her understanding of both her family history and her own capabilities. During his meeting with college administrators, Colonel Thompson found himself thinking about Sarah Martinez and her situation. The harassment she described was unfortunately common in educational environments, but her analytical approach to dealing with it suggested someone with natural aptitude for psychological operations. Combined with her family military heritage and obvious personal resilience, she represented exactly the kind of individual the military was always seeking to recruit. The colonel also made discreet inquiries about Sarah's academic performance and reputation among faculty members. What he learned impressed him further. Despite the social challenges she faced, Sarah maintained a strong grade point average and was particularly noted for her insightful contributions in psychology courses. Her professors described her as mature beyond her years, with an intuitive understanding of human behavior that enhanced class discussions. When they met later in the student center, Colonel Thompson came prepared with information that would change Sarah's understanding of her grandfather's legacy and her own future possibilities. He had contacted military records databases and confirmed that Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez had indeed served with distinction in psychological operations units during some of the most sensitive missions of the Vietnam era. Your grandfather was more than just a good soldier, Colonel Thompson explained as they sat in a quiet corner of the student center. He was part of a highly classified program that successfully disrupted enemy communications and morale throughout his deployment. His psychological profiles and mission reports show someone with exceptional analytical skills and unshakable mental discipline. Sarah listened with growing amazement as the colonel described specific commendations and mission successes that her grandfather had never mentioned to his family. The picture that emerged was of a man who had faced extraordinary challenges and emerged not just intact, but stronger and more capable than before his service.
But what does this mean for me? Sarah asked.
I mean, it's incredible to learn about his service, but I can't exactly follow in his footsteps. Colonel Thompson leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more intense.
That's where you might be wrong.
The military has evolved significantly since your grandfather's time, and we're always looking for individuals with the right psychological makeup for specialized roles. Physical requirements have been modified for many positions, particularly those involving intelligence analysis, psychological operations, and strategic planning. The conversation that followed would plant seeds that would grow into possibilities Sarah had never imagined. The colonel explained modern military roles that could utilize her evident psychological insights and analytical skills, positions where her wheelchair would be irrelevant to her effectiveness. He also described educational programs and support systems that could help her develop her natural abilities while honoring her grandfather's legacy. As their meeting concluded, Colonel Thompson handed Sarah his business card and made an offer that would echo in her mind for days to come. If you're interested in exploring these possibilities further, I'd like to arrange for you to visit our psychological operations training facility. Not as a commitment, but as an educational experience. I think you might be surprised by what you discover about yourself and what you're capable of achieving. Sarah left that meeting with her mind racing and her heart pounding. The encounter with Colonel Thompson had opened doors she hadn't even known existed, while simultaneously helping her understand that the daily battles she fought on campus were preparing her for much larger challenges and opportunities. The PSYOP ghost patch on her jacket suddenly felt less like a family heirloom and more like a roadmap to her own future. 3 weeks after her life-changing encounter with Colonel Thompson, Sarah Martinez found herself sitting in the passenger seat of a military transport vehicle, watching the landscape change from suburban sprawl to the carefully maintained grounds of Fort Braxton. The military installation specialized in psychological operations training and research, and Sarah was about to experience firsthand what her grandfather had endured decades earlier in the jungles of Vietnam.
The decision to accept Colonel Thompson's invitation hadn't been easy.
Sarah's mother had initially opposed the idea, worried that her daughter was chasing impossible dreams that would only lead to heartbreak. Her few remaining friends from high school had expressed skepticism about her sudden interest in military service. Even some of her college professors had questioned whether she was making decisions based on emotional reaction to harassment rather than genuine career planning. But Sarah had researched extensively in the days following her meeting with the colonel. She discovered that modern military psychological operations relied heavily on intelligence analysis, strategic communication, and understanding of human behavioral patterns, all areas where physical mobility was irrelevant to success. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that this path might offer opportunities that traditional career routes would never provide. The entrance to Fort Braxton was imposing, with multiple security checkpoints and guards who examined Sarah's temporary visitor credentials with professional thoroughness. Colonel Thompson had arranged for her to participate in a 3-day orientation program designed to introduce potential recruits to psychological operations methodology. The program was typically reserved for active military personnel, but the colonel had made special arrangements based on Sarah's unique background and demonstrated capabilities. Captain Rebecca Hayes met Sarah at the processing center, offering a warm smile and firm handshake that immediately put her at ease. Captain Hayes was a 15-year veteran of psychological operations who had served in multiple theaters and now led training programs for new recruits. Her presence was both professional and approachable, embodying the confidence that came from extensive experience in challenging environments. "Welcome to Fort Braxton, Sarah," Captain Hayes said as she led the way toward the main training facility. "Colonel Thompson has told me quite a bit about you and your family's military heritage. We're excited to show you what modern psychological operations training involves." The first day of Sarah's orientation focused on theoretical foundations and historical context. She joined a class of 12 active duty personnel who were beginning their PSYOP specialization training. The classroom environment was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in college. Every discussion was focused, purposeful, and grounded in real-world applications that could mean the difference between mission success and failure.
The instructor, Major Patricia Collins, had an impressive background in battlefield psychology and strategic communication.
Her teaching style was direct and challenging, pushing students to think beyond conventional approaches to problem solving. When she learned that Sarah was a civilian visitor with family ties to Vietnam-era PSYOP operations, Major Collins made specific efforts to connect historical examples to modern applications.
Psychological operations haven't changed in their fundamental purpose, Major Collins explained to the class.
We still seek to influence behavior and decision-making through careful application of information and psychological pressure. But our tools and understanding have evolved dramatically since the 1960s. Sarah found herself completely absorbed in the coursework. Topics covered included behavioral analysis, cultural psychology, strategic communication, and the ethical framework that governs psychological operations in modern military contexts. The intellectual rigor was demanding, but Sarah discovered that her college psychology courses and her personal experiences with systematic harassment had provided an excellent foundation for understanding advanced concepts. During a practical exercise on the second day, students were divided into teams and given scenarios that required them to develop psychological influence strategies for various situations. Sarah's team was assigned a hostage negotiation scenario where traditional tactical approaches had failed and psychological intervention was needed to resolve the crisis peacefully. Working with active duty personnel who initially seemed skeptical about including a civilian wheelchair user in their exercise, Sarah quickly demonstrated her analytical capabilities and strategic thinking. Her approach to understanding the hostage-taker's motivations and developing a communication strategy impressed both her teammates and the evaluating instructors. Sarah's insight into the psychological dynamics of the scenario was exceptional, Sergeant First Class Michael Rodriguez commented during the team's debriefing session. She identified behavioral patterns and pressure points that the rest of us missed, and her communication strategy addressed core psychological needs rather than just tactical considerations. The validation from experienced military personnel was enormously meaningful to Sarah. These were individuals who understood psychological operations at a practical level, who had applied these techniques in real-world situations where lives depended on their expertise. Their respect for her contributions confirmed that her instincts and analytical skills were genuinely valuable in this field. But the most significant moment of Sarah's orientation came during a private meeting with Major Collins on the final day. The Major had been observing Sarah's performance throughout the program and had some specific observations to share. "I've reviewed your family's military records," Major Collins began, "and I want you to understand something important about your grandfather's service. Staff Sergeant Martinez wasn't just a good soldier who happened to work in psychological operations. His psychological evaluations and mission reports indicate someone with extraordinary natural ability for this type of work." Major Collins opened a folder containing declassified documents related to Miguel Martinez's service record. Sarah read with growing amazement about specific missions her grandfather had conducted, including successful psychological operations that had saved numerous American lives by convincing enemy units to surrender rather than fight. "The psychological profile developed during your grandfather's training shows remarkable stability under pressure, exceptional analytical thinking, and an intuitive understanding of human motivation that couldn't be taught," the Major continued. "Based on what I've observed during your orientation, you've inherited many of those same qualities." The conversation that followed would reshape Sarah's understanding of her own potential and future possibilities. Major Collins explained that the military was actively recruiting individuals with psychological operations aptitude, and that Sarah's disability would not prevent her from pursuing this career path. Modern PSYOP roles included intelligence analysis, strategic planning, and communication development, all fields where her wheelchair would be completely irrelevant to her effectiveness. "We have several current personnel in psychological operations who have various physical limitations," Major Collins explained. "What matters in this field is mental acuity, psychological resilience, and the ability to think strategically under pressure. You've demonstrated all of those qualities during your short time here." The Major also addressed practical concerns about military service with a disability. She described accommodation programs, modified training protocols, and assignment options that would allow Sarah to serve effectively while managing her physical limitations. The picture that emerged was of a military organization that had evolved to recognize and utilize diverse talents and capabilities.
During her final evening at Fort Braxton, Sarah joined several of her orientation classmates for dinner in the base cafeteria.
The conversations revealed that many of these experienced soldiers faced their own challenges and uncertainties about their PSYOP training. But they had also developed a strong sense of camaraderie and mutual support that Sarah had never experienced in civilian educational environments. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been initially skeptical about Sarah's participation, approached her during dinner with an unexpected admission. "I want to apologize for my attitude when you first joined our exercise group," he said. "I made assumptions based on your wheelchair rather than giving you a chance to show what you could do. That was unprofessional and unfair." "I'm used to it," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "Most people see the wheelchair before they see anything else about me."
"Well, that's their loss," Sergeant Rodriguez responded.
"You've got a better understanding of psychological tactics than most people I've worked with, including some who have years of field experience. I hope you decide to pursue this path." As Sarah prepared to leave Fort Braxton the following morning, Colonel Thompson met with her one final time to discuss her experiences and future options. His assessment of her performance during the orientation was overwhelmingly positive, and he was prepared to discuss specific steps for moving forward if she was interested in pursuing military service. "Your instructors were unanimous in their evaluation," Colonel Thompson reported. "You demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking and psychological insight that we need in modern PSYOP roles.
The question now is whether this is a path you want to pursue."
Sarah had been wrestling with this decision throughout her time at Fort Braxton. The training had been challenging but exhilarating, offering intellectual stimulation and purpose that she had never found in civilian academic environments. The sense of belonging and mutual respect among the military personnel was something she desperately craved after months of harassment and isolation at college. But pursuing this path would mean leaving behind the familiar world of civilian education and committing to a career that would demand everything she had to give. It would mean confronting new challenges and proving herself repeatedly in environments where failure could have serious consequences. Most importantly, it would mean fully embracing her grandfather's legacy and the responsibility that came with wearing his PSYOP patch with legitimate authority.
"I need some time to think about it," Sarah told Colonel Thompson.
"This has been an incredible experience, but it's also a major life decision that will affect everything about my future."
"Take all the time you need," the colonel replied. "But I want you to know that we would be honored to have you join our team. Your grandfather would be proud of what you've accomplished here, and I believe you have the potential to exceed even his distinguished service record."
As Sarah was driven away from Fort Braxton, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when she had first worn her grandfather's patch to college. The harassment from Jessica Palmer and other students seemed almost trivial now compared to the possibilities that lay ahead. She had discovered capabilities within herself that she had never known existed, and she had found a community of professionals who valued her mind rather than judging her physical limitations. The PSYOP ghost patch on her jacket felt different now, heavier with new understanding of what it represented, but also lighter because she finally comprehended the legacy she carried. Her grandfather had faced his own battles and emerged as a decorated veteran who had saved lives through psychological courage and strategic thinking. The question facing Sarah now was whether she had the courage to follow in his footsteps and create her own legacy of service and achievement. But first, she had to return to Riverside Community College and confront the small-scale psychological warfare that had been her daily reality for months. Armed with new knowledge and confidence, Sarah was ready to transform her approach to dealing with harassment and discrimination. The real test of her psychological operations training was about to begin in the most unexpected of places, the hallways and classrooms where she had once felt powerless and alone. Sarah Martinez returned to Riverside Community College with a transformation that was invisible to casual observers but profound in its implications. The 3 days at Fort Braxton had equipped her with more than theoretical knowledge about psychological operations. She now possessed the confidence and strategic framework to address the harassment that had dominated her college experience. The PSYOP ghost patch on her denim jacket remained in its usual position, but Sarah now understood exactly what it represented and had earned the right to wear it through her own demonstrated capabilities. As she wheeled across the campus that Monday morning, she noticed the familiar stares and whispers, but her psychological response was completely different. Instead of feeling vulnerable and isolated, she began analyzing the social dynamics around her with the trained eye of someone who understood behavioral patterns and strategic influence. Jessica Palmer was waiting near the library entrance with her usual group of followers, and Sarah could see them preparing for another round of harassment. But, this time, Sarah was prepared with tactics developed through military-grade psychological operations training. Rather than avoiding the confrontation or enduring it passively, she decided to implement a strategic response that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic between them. Well, if it isn't our favorite wheelchair freak," Jessica called out loudly, ensuring that passing students would witness the encounter. "How's life rolling along down there?" Sarah stopped her wheelchair directly in front of Jessica, maintaining steady eye contact and a calm expression that immediately signaled something different about this interaction. Instead of looking away or hurrying past, she studied Jessica's face with the analytical intensity she had learned during her military training. "Jessica Palmer, psychology major, originally from Riverside Heights," Sarah said calmly, demonstrating that she had researched her antagonist thoroughly. "Transferred here after academic difficulties at UC San Diego, currently living with her parents despite claiming to be independent." Jessica's confident smirk faltered slightly as she realized that Sarah knew specific details about her background that weren't generally known among the student population. The shift in power dynamics was subtle but noticeable to her followers, who exchanged uncertain glances. "I've been studying psychological warfare techniques," Sarah continued, her voice remaining perfectly calm and professional. "It's fascinating how bullying behaviors follow predictable patterns, especially when the perpetrator is compensating for their own insecurities and failures." The psychological analysis was delivered without emotion or malice, making it more unsettling than any angry response would have been. Sarah had learned during her military training that effective psychological operations relied on accuracy and timing rather than emotional manipulation or crude intimidation tactics. "You think you're smart because you did some research?" Jessica responded, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. She was beginning to realize that this encounter was not following the script she had become accustomed to controlling. "Research is part of it," Sarah agreed. "But observation and pattern analysis are equally important. For example, I've noticed that your harassment escalates when you're stressed about your own academic performance. Your last round of particularly cruel comments coincided exactly with midterm week, when you were struggling with your statistics course." Jessica's face flushed as Sarah's analysis hit uncomfortably close to the truth. Several of her followers were now looking at her with curiosity rather than admiration, wondering how Sarah had gained such insight into Jessica's personal struggles. But Sarah wasn't finished demonstrating her newly acquired psychological tactics. She had learned at Fort Braxton that effective influence required offering alternatives rather than simply applying pressure, and she was prepared to provide Jessica with a path forward that would benefit both of them. "I have a proposition for you," Sarah said, her tone shifting to one of professional collaboration rather than confrontation. "You're clearly intelligent and capable of leadership, but you're directing those abilities toward destructive purposes that ultimately harm your own reputation and relationships." Jessica found herself listening despite her intention to dismiss whatever Sarah was about to say. The respectful acknowledgement of her capabilities was unexpected and more disarming than any insult could have been. "I'm starting a student organization focused on disability awareness and inclusion," Sarah continued. "We need someone with your communication skills and social connections to help develop outreach programs. It would look excellent on graduate school applications and provide leadership experience that's actually constructive." The offer was strategically crafted to appeal to Jessica's underlying motivations while providing her with a face-saving way to end the harassment campaign. Sarah had recognized that Jessica's cruel behavior stemmed partly from a need for social status and recognition, needs that could be redirected toward positive purposes if the right opportunity was presented. Jessica stared at Sarah for several long moments, clearly struggling to process this unexpected turn in their relationship. Her followers watched with fascination as their leader found herself in uncharted psychological territory, unsure how to respond to an offer of collaboration from someone they had spent months tormenting.
"Why would you want to work with me?" Jessica asked, her voice showing genuine confusion. "After everything I've done to make your life miserable here?" Sarah smiled slightly, recognizing the psychological opening that Jessica had inadvertently provided.
"Because I understand that people's behavior usually reflects their circumstances and insecurities rather than their fundamental character. You have leadership abilities and social influence that could accomplish positive things if directed appropriately."
The response demonstrated Sarah's growing sophistication in psychological operations.
Rather than seeking revenge or trying to humiliate Jessica, she was offering a strategic alliance that could benefit both parties while eliminating the harassment that had plagued her college experience. Over the following weeks, Sarah's approach to campus social dynamics continued to evolve based on her military training. She began identifying other students who faced various forms of discrimination or harassment, offering support and helping them develop their own strategic responses to social challenges. Her disability awareness organization grew rapidly as students recognized her genuine commitment to creating positive change. Jessica Palmer, after several days of internal struggle, eventually approached Sarah to discuss the possibility of joining the Disability Awareness Initiative. The conversation that followed was tentative and sometimes awkward, but it represented a fundamental shift in their relationship from antagonistic to potentially collaborative.
"I don't know why I was so cruel to you," Jessica admitted during their private meeting in the student center.
"I guess I was dealing with my own problems and took them out on someone I saw as an easy target." Sarah's response reflected the psychological insight she had developed through her military training and personal experience. Cruelty often comes from pain or insecurity that people don't know how to address constructively. The important thing is recognizing the pattern and choosing to change it. The transformation in Jessica's behavior was gradual but unmistakable. She began actively discouraging other students from making cruel comments about disabilities, and eventually became one of the most effective advocates for inclusive policies on campus. The change wasn't just superficial compliance. Jessica had genuinely begun to understand and regret the harm her previous behavior had caused.
Meanwhile, Sarah's academic performance improved dramatically as she was no longer distracted by daily harassment and social anxiety.
Her professors noticed her increased confidence and participation in class discussions, particularly in psychology courses where her military training provided unique insights into human behavior and strategic thinking. Colonel Thompson maintained regular contact with Sarah throughout this period, monitoring her development and discussing her future career options. He was impressed by her practical application of psychological operations principles in civilian contexts, and he began discussing specific military positions that would utilize her demonstrated capabilities. "You've successfully conducted a textbook psychological influence campaign," Colonel Thompson observed during one of their monthly meetings. "You identified your opponent's motivations, developed a strategic response that addressed underlying issues rather than just symptoms, and achieved a positive outcome that benefited everyone involved." The colonel's analysis helped Sarah understand that her experiences at college had provided practical training in psychological operations that complemented her formal military education. She had learned to analyze social dynamics, develop strategic responses to hostile behavior, and influence outcomes through psychological insight rather than emotional reaction. As the semester progressed, Sarah's reputation on campus evolved from wheelchair freak to respected student leader and disability rights advocate. Her organization's events drew significant attendance, and her insights into inclusive education policies gained attention from college administrators. The transformation was so complete that new students who arrived the following semester had no idea about the harassment Sarah had endured just months earlier. The final validation of Sarah's psychological development came when she was invited to speak at a regional conference on disability rights and inclusion in higher education. Her presentation focused on strategic approaches to addressing discrimination and building inclusive communities through understanding rather than confrontation.
"Psychological warfare isn't just a military concept," Sarah told the conference audience. "Anyone facing systematic harassment or discrimination is engaged in a form of psychological combat.
The key is understanding that the most effective responses focus on changing underlying dynamics rather than simply fighting individual battles. The speech drew a standing ovation and led to requests for Sarah to speak at other institutions facing similar challenges. Her approach to addressing discrimination through psychological insight rather than legal confrontation or emotional appeals was seen as innovative and highly effective. Colonel Thompson attended Sarah's conference presentation and was struck by how fully she had integrated psychological operations principles into her civilian advocacy work. During their conversation afterward, he made an offer that would complete her transformation from harassment victim to military psychological operations specialist. "We have an opening in our strategic communication division that would be perfect for your skills and interests," the colonel explained. "You would work on developing psychological influence strategies for complex international situations, drawing on exactly the kind of analytical thinking and strategic insight you've demonstrated here." Sarah's decision to accept the military position was made easier by her success in transforming her college experience from nightmare to triumph. She had proven to herself and others that physical limitations were irrelevant when faced with challenges that required psychological resilience and strategic thinking. On her final day at Riverside Community College, Sarah was surprised by a farewell gathering organized by students she had helped throughout her time on campus. Jessica Palmer was among those who spoke about Sarah's impact on campus culture and their personal development. "Sarah taught me that strength isn't about making other people feel small," Jessica said during the informal ceremony. "Real strength comes from helping others discover their own capabilities and building communities where everyone can succeed." The PSYOP ghost patch on Sarah's jacket had become a symbol of transformation that extended far beyond her personal journey. Other students had begun researching their own family military histories, and several had contacted military recruiters about psychological operations careers. Sarah's example had demonstrated that military service was accessible to people with disabilities and that psychological warfare skills had valuable civilian applications. As Sarah prepared to begin her military career, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from isolated harassment victim to respected leader and military professional. Her grandfather's legacy had provided the initial inspiration, but her own courage and strategic thinking had created the transformation that changed not just her life but the lives of everyone she encountered. The wheelchair that others had seen as a symbol of weakness had become, in Sarah's mind and the minds of those around her, a throne of wisdom from which she had conducted successful psychological operations that honored her grandfather's service while creating her own legacy of courage and achievement. The mockery had ended not through confrontation or legal action, but through the strategic application of psychological insight that transformed enemies into allies and created lasting positive change for everyone involved.